Morning, everybody. Hope you're doing well. I think we'll go ahead and get started. I don't know. Running a little bit later than normal. I don't know how much time we've got, but we'll get through what we can. Let's see here. I may need to get somebody to help me with this. Well, the PowerPoint isn't working. Somebody back there who knows what they're doing, so hopefully it'll work. There we go. We're going through a study of Christian evidences, or apologetics, it's sometimes called, giving us reasons to believe the things that we believe, and we started by looking at some reasons to believe in God, good reasons to believe in God, and then we went from there to assuming there's a God and there are good reasons to believe in God, then how does God communicate to us? And so then we started looking at some evidence that the Bible is a very unique book in a number of ways, and I believe more than just unique. A couple of verses to remember. Isaiah 40, the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, Jesus said. And so we're looking at evidence for the Bible being God's word. The Bible makes that claim over and over and over and over again. So far we've looked at these things: the unity of the Bible, the popularity of the Bible, the fact that there's no mistakes in the Bible, the influence of the Bible, survival of persecution, the way the Bible has survived the persecution and Bible-believing people, the lack of partiality, the scientific foreknowledge. You don't see anything in the Bible that from the time of when it was written that was wrong. Scientifically or otherwise, and that's what you would expect. If God inspires a book, then it's not going to have a bunch of inaccurate information in it. And then we looked at prophecy. We looked at several. We didn't look at anywhere near all, but prophecy is another thing that is pretty remarkable about, and I passed out a thing about the different prophecies of Jesus. In this lesson, we want to look at some evidence which indicates that the Bible did not come from men, but it must have come from God, and that is in the area of archaeology. We want to look at a little bit how archaeology has confirmed the accuracy of the Bible. There are literally thousands, or maybe even millions, of discoveries, things that they've dug up, which have confirmed the Bible. And in fact, to read all of those would be very repetitious and probably boring. Let me say this: there's so much in the world of archaeology. We could probably spend an entire quarter just on this. We're not going to do that. I'm going to try to get through what I have today. I don't know for sure that we'll be able to get through it all, but I'll try. But we're going to be looking at some of the things. We're not going to look at anywhere near all of the things. And in addition to that, I want to emphasize that we're really going to be, for the most part, looking at it kind of a cursory way. A lot of these things I'm just going to barely mention and go on when we might be able to spend 5 or 10, 15 minutes, in some cases an hour on them. I'm just going to kind of mention those things. So remember that a lot more could be said than what I'm going to say. And so I'm going to start kind of at the beginning. These things that people have dug up around the world, predominantly in the Middle East, but these things, some of them have been very remarkable, and they've been remarkable in a number of ways. And so I'm going to start at the beginning, the idea that in every area of the world there are stories of creation. Written stories referring to, in the beginning, a chaos of water called the deep, upper and lower firmaments, established heavens and earth, made grass and green herbs to grow, formed man out of the dust of the ground. In a garden was their dwelling. The seventh day was a holy day. There's artifacts and things that they have dug up from ancient civilizations, really all over the world, and they have these stories about creation. Tablets of stone that have been in circulation for 4,000 years, maybe more. Found in the ruins of Babylon, Nineveh, Nipput, Ashur, which have accounts of creation which are very similar to the Bible. Some would say that these are just an indication that people were superstitious. But it's still interesting that there aren't any other really explanations for how things began. Some accounts speak of gods in the plural, but none speak of these ancient things. None of them speak of anything coming into existence other than through a story of creation. And remember that in some of these instances, in some of the civilizations, these were not ignorant people. There are certain things that were done in certain civilizations. We still don't understand how they did some of the things that they did. So there's been a lot of things that have been dug up along those lines. Another thing is monotheism. The Bible shows that there's one God and that a belief in many gods, idols, developed later. But scientists have now found that many civilizations, including the Babylon and the Egyptian civilizations, began with a belief in one God. And so there's lots of artifacts that they've dug up that indicate that kind of thing. In fact, nothing has been found which indicates that any civilization from back in ancient times began with a belief in multiple gods or those kinds of things. One discovery in 1898 showed 3 separate tablets, and these are now in a British museum, but it showed 3 separate tablets with the words Jehovah is God on them. And so lots of those kinds of things have been dug up. I'm going to get to what I think are some more interesting ones, but we'll start at the beginning here. In 1918, some scientists found indications that the place where most people believe the Garden of Eden to have been, Eridu, may have been the first city ever built. And so they found some things there. This is a very interesting one, the temptation seal, or sometimes called the Adam and Eve seal. It's from an ancient tablet in Babylon, which shows a picture of a tree. I don't know how well you can see that, but there's a tree in the middle there with 2 people on each side, a man on one side, a woman on the other side picking fruit. Behind the woman, if you see on the left there, is a serpent, is standing and whispering to the woman. As I said, it's also known as the Adam and Eve seal. It was found in 1932 and is dated about 3500 BC. Now think about this for a second. We're going to go through a bunch of this stuff, but think about this for a second. This thing was discovered in 1932. So let's round it off to 2000. It laid in the ground for 5,500 years. And somebody finally dug it up. Well, you read the account in Genesis 3, and that's what you find, of course, with the story of Adam and Eve. For many years, skeptics and unbelievers said that Adam could not possibly have used metals, as it says. And by the way, we're not going to take a look at all these scriptures. We don't have time. But that Adam could not have used metals, as it says in Genesis 4. There was no other indication anywhere that anybody had that anybody used metals before 1200 BC, which would be just a little bit before the time of Moses, between Moses and Joseph. In 1933, an iron blade made in Babylon about 2700 BC was found. Copper instruments were also found in the ruins of cities from before the flood. And so, and by the way, I'm not going to necessarily get into, at least not in heavy ways, how they date these things, but there's a number of ways, there's a variety of ways that they can date these things when they dig them up. But the early use of metals is something that for years the skeptics said, well, no, here's proof that the Bible's wrong. See, there's no record of man using metals this early. And then they dig something up that shows it. The flood, virtually every civilization has stories about a great flood over the earth. The Egyptians say that the gods purified the earth with one and only a few escaped. In Greek tradition, Deucalion built an ark and sent a dove out twice. In the Hindu tradition, Manu built a ship and escaped from a great flood. In the Chinese version, Fa He escaped a flood with his wife, 3 sons, and their wives. In England, Druids, which legend said had a legend which said a righteous patriarch was saved from the flood when man was destroyed for wickedness. The Polynesians have stories about 8 people escaping from a flood. Mexican civilizations, man and his family were saved from a great flood. According to the Peruvians, a man and his family were saved from floodwaters by floating in a box. In different Indian legends, 1, 3, or 8 were saved from a flood in a big boat, and it rested on a mountain. In Greenland, the earth once tipped over and everybody drowned except 1 man and 1 woman. So you've got these stories from all civilizations, and we're talking about from pretty ancient times. Every branch of human civilization has a story of a flood which destroyed all of mankind except 1 family. In 1872, some tablets from Nineveh were found which had an account of a flood almost exactly as the biblical account. Flood deposits have actually been found around the world. In the early 1900s, huge layers of clay were found under current land surface, and there were obvious civilizations below them. Another thing that we find from ancient writings, the long life before the flood. Pretty much everybody's aware, I think, that if you look at the age of people in the Bible and you get to Genesis 6 where the flood occurred, and then you begin to look at the ages, it says so-and-so lived to a certain number of years and died. When you get past the flood, those numbers are reduced dramatically. You've got, Noah lived how many, 600 and some whatever years he lived. Methuselah, 969, I think it was. And so you've got these people living hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And then after the flood, the biblical record clearly indicates that the age of people was considerably less, like at the most a little over 100 or something like that. Well, there's evidence that they have found early tablets from Babylon show 10 kings from before the flood and how long they reigned. And this shows that there was a belief that people lived incredibly long before this flood story that they had. Now, for many, many years, the supposed experts claimed that it was not possible that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, at the time that it was claimed he wrote them, okay? For years and years and years, they said it's not possible that Moses wrote these things. It would be about 1500 BC. And they said there's no evidence anywhere else that man had the ability to communicate and write in these ways during the time that this Moses lived, about 1500 BC. They thought that they had to take this view because there were a lot of prophecies there in the first 5 books of the Bible, and so they were kind of forced into this idea that, well, it's not possible. It's just like we were talking about with Daniel. They said it's not possible that Moses could have written these at the time they wrote them, that it's claimed that he wrote them. And their motivation was there were prophecies that came true. And so it's easier just to say, well, he wrote it later than that. He couldn't have written it in 1500 BC. He must have written it later than that. And for a long time they said there's no other evidence in archaeology or in any of the records that shows that man had the ability to write in that way around the time of Moses. That all changed when certain discoveries began to be made. Discoveries forced the experts to give up that idea really a long, long time ago. Probably a couple hundred years ago, they began to give up that. The critics had to admit that they were once again wrong and the Bible was right. Even in this one area of whether there was writing in the time of Moses or not, there have been many discoveries, and we're going to look at a bunch of them, but we're not going to look at all of them. But there's certainly more than can possibly be explained away. And so we want to look at some of these. The Weld dynastic. It was written by Nur-Ninshbur in 2170 BC and gives a list of the kings from the beginning of his race up to his time. It dates more than 100 years before Abraham and not far, by the way, from Abraham's home. And so that's one. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly here. The Behistun rock, discovered in 1855, it's the key to the Babylonian language. It was engraved in 516 BC by the order of Darius, the king of Persia. Ezra speaks of this Darius under whom the temple was rebuilt, and there's a picture of it, the Behistun rock. Now again, think about this. This is 1855, and it was dated in about 500 BC. And so just rounding it off, if you even round it off to 1800, that's 2,300 years right there. That before this thing was discovered. Many are familiar with the Rosetta Stone. It's dated around 196 BC. It's about 3'8" high. It's about 2.5 feet wide. It was discovered in 1798 by some French troops under Napoleon. When Napoleon went in, they found some of these artifacts, and this was one of them. This is one of the keys to the Egyptian language. Complete libraries of books have now been found that date before the time of Abraham. So remember your timeline. For years and years and years, they said, oh, it's not possible that anybody could have written the way Moses wrote in 1500 BC. They've now found libraries of books and actually around the home of Abraham. And Abraham predates Moses about 500 years or so. And so we're talking about 2000 to 2500 BC that we've gotten some of these things. Many libraries which are dated before Abraham have been found in the ruins of Ur, which is where Abraham was. Remember, Abraham was from Ur of Chaldees. Nippur, Lagash, and Sippar. These were all mostly found in the late 1800s. In all, there are libraries which total more than 100,000 volumes. Included in these books are dictionaries, grammar books, reference works, encyclopedias, official records, books on math, medicine, historical texts, geography, astronomy, religion, and politics. Some of these findings here in this group were where schools were. They've determined that there were actually schools there. There's some evidence that it is very possible. This kind of blows my mind. It's entirely possible. Again, 100,000 volumes. Now these are tablets. These are stone tablets. But it's entirely possible that where they found some of this stuff, which was a school, was actually the school that Abraham attended. Sippar is also called Akkad. One of its names means book town, which indicates it was famous for its libraries. On one tablet, there are parallel columns which show the complete figuration of Semitic vocabulary or words and Sumerian vocabulary. But all of these and more show that it's ridiculous to say that there wasn't an intelligent form of writing in the day of Moses. But of course, that's not enough to convince the skeptics who've already made their minds up. What a coincidence, right? For hundreds of years, they said the Bible was the only document that indicated that a person could write in this way in the time of Moses. And then all of a sudden, what luck, they uncover more than 100,000 volumes that predate Moses. Now, let me go on to some other archaeological finds which prove and confirm some other things. There are lots and lots of pre-flood writings. There have been many writings found in the areas of Ur, Kish, and Pharaoh, which are dated before the flood. Sodom and Gomorrah, a lot of people are familiar with this. Near the Dead Sea is a place called Bab Edra. Indicates that around 2500 to 2000 BC, it was a very prosperous place, and that the civilization ended quickly. It appears from the area that some cataclysm changed the soil and the climate while wiping out the population. Now, ordinarily, if archaeologists were to dig up a place like this, they would have no explanation for it whatsoever. This was a very well-populated area. It was apparently very prosperous place, and the indication is something happened dramatically and quickly that changed the soil and changed the climate of this place and wiped out the population. There is a stratum, a layer of salt 150 feet thick that they've dug up with sulfur above it. And so it appears that the salt and sulfur in the area were thrown together at the right time, which, guess what, would cause the skies to turn red and literally rain fire and brimstone down on Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot's wife, we know, was turned into a pillar of salt because she disobeyed the Lord. They found many pillars of salt that they dug up in this area. And so that's interesting there near the bottom of the Dead Sea, or south of the Dead Sea. The Telerama Tablets, they were found in Egypt by a peasant woman in 1887-88. These tablets were written during the time of Moses, about 1450 BC. There are about 500 tablets on which were written letters by different kings in Palestine and Syria to the pharaohs of Egypt. These letters refer to the Hebrews, and by the way, they didn't spell it like that, but the Israelites and the Canaanites. They show that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt and enemies of the Canaanites. So, and that's another thing, and we won't talk about it, won't go into the details of it, but for many years, it was thought by archaeologists and other experts that the Hebrews, the Israelites, had never actually been in Canaan. They said the Bible is the only place that shows that the Israelites were ever in Canaan. These and a bunch of other stuff shows, no, it shows that they were there. It shows that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt and they were enemies to the Canaanites. And then later it shows that they were in the land of Canaan as well. The tablets record the custom of bowing down 7 times when meeting a superior. Thus the statement in Genesis 33, and he, that is Jacob, himself passed over before them. He bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother Esau. And so these tablets show that that is during this time period, that is a show of respect. And so we now here, 4,000 plus years later, reading Genesis 33, we might say, well, in reading that, well, I wonder why he bowed down 7 times. Well, in that culture, it was a show of respect. These tablets also mention Jerusalem. And by the way, that's another thing. Until these tablets were found, the experts said that there was no place named Jerusalem that was this old from this time period. There was no record of it anywhere except in the Bible. And of course, they dug it up. That's not a coincidence. It's because God's word is truth. Some may have heard of the black obelisk. It's a black marble monument cut about 850 or so BC. It was found about 1845, somewhere along in there. So again, think about the amount of time these things laid in the ground. 1,800 years plus, let's round it off to 800. For more than 2,600 years, these things laid in the ground. It's a black stone. It's about 7 feet high. On it is a figure with Jewish features kneeling at the feet of the king. And this is the inscription. The inscription is, the tribute of Jehu, the son or successor of Omri, silver, gold, bowls of gold, chalices of gold, cups of gold, vases of gold, lead, scepter for the king, and spear shafts I have received. And so this king is receiving these things, and that story is told in 2 Kings chapter 10. We're going to keep moving. The Moabite stone, some of you may have heard of the Moabite stone, found about 1868. It's a bluish stone, 4 feet high, about 2 feet wide, 14 inches thick. It tells about the Moabites winning back their independence after Ahab died. It correctly pictures many details of the relationships between Israel and Moab, and Jehovah is mentioned on the Moabite stone. Abraham's visit to the king, which we can read about in Genesis chapter 12, is thought to have been pictured on the tomb of Senusert II, who was an Egyptian pharaoh. That's the mound where it is, and then on the left is the actual stone with the carving on it. Hammurabi's battle with Abraham. Some of you may have be familiar with the Hammurabi stone. The Amraphel of Genesis chapter 14 is identified by most archaeologists as Hammurabi. And if that's the truth, then we have Abraham defeating in battle the most famous king of that time period. Abraham went to war against him. Now, here's the Code of Hammurabi. It's a huge block of stone. It's 8 feet tall, 2 feet wide. It has a code of laws written on it, and it is dated around the time of Abraham, about 2250. And remember, Abraham lived, how old was Abraham when he died? He was 200, I think, or almost 200. And so he lived quite a span of time there. It was found in 1902. Okay, so again, we're talking about more than 4,000 years that this laid in the ground. It has about 4,000 lines of writing on it. A king is mentioned, which is also mentioned in Genesis chapter 14. It shows that a woman who was childish and could give a handmaid to her husband and claim the children born. Who does that sound like? Abraham giving Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham to have a child. And we can read about that there, of course. So that's the Code of Hammurabi. The Tower of Babel, a cylinder at the place where the Tower of Babel is supposed to have been, was found, and it speaks of a tower which wasn't finished. There are actually 2 sites around the ancient Babylon with inscriptions. 10 miles southwest of the center of Babylon, the inscription on the cylinder says this: "The Tower of Borsippa, which a former king erected and completed to a height of 42 cubits, whose summit he did not finish, fell to ruins in ancient times. There was no proper care of its gutters, for the water, rain, and storms had washed away its brick, and the tiles of its roof were broken. The great god Marduk urged me to restore it. I did not alter its site or change its foundation walls. At a favorable time, I renewed its brickwork and its roofing tiles, and I wrote my name on the cornices of the edifice. I built it anew as it had been ages before. I erected its pinnacle as it was written in remote days. And so there you have the Tower of Babel. At least, it doesn't seem like it could be a coincidence if this guy's talking about a tower that was started and then it quit. And it's found right around Babylon, which, of course, Babylon, the city of Babylon, how it got its name came about because of the Tower of Babel. Most archaeologists think that the actual site of the tower was in the center of Babylon with the ruins of the Marduk temple. A tablet was found there that reads, "The building of this illustrious tower offended the gods. In a night they threw down what they had built. They scattered them abroad and made strange their speech." The area is now a hole about 330 feet square, and it's used as a quarry from which to take bricks. But isn't it interesting? This is this tablet from this time period, and it says the gods were offended, and they knocked down this tower. They scattered the people and made their speech strange. Sounds exactly like the Tower of Babel. When are we going to get done here? At what time, Wayne? Okay. We're not going to get through all this. That's okay. That's okay. That's okay. We'll finish it next week. The bricks of Pithom. The bricks of Pithom, the city of Pithom, which is in Egypt, was found in the late 1800s. Now get this. If you remember your Bible story, the lower parts of the walls were found to have straw in the bricks. The middle parts had less straw, and the upper parts had no straw. It was all clay. Remember the story of Pharaoh and the Israelites were building building the walls in the city, and they started complaining some. And so and by the way, Egypt, as far as I know and as far as I've been able to tell, Egypt from this time period is the only civilization that used straw in their brick in building their walls. But if you remember, they complained, and so Pharaoh said, "You're going to have to start getting your own straw." And then they complained some more, as I remember it, and he took away all the straw they had and said, "If you're going to use any straw as a filler, you're going to have to get your own." And so it's interesting. The bottom part of this thing, these walls, have straw. The middle parts have less, and the upper parts don't have any. It was all clay. Now, on the right are the remains of mud bricks in this area, dating to the time of the Exodus. I don't know how well you can see it, but notice the holes from where the straw has decayed. And so they dug this up, and that's one example of why they can tell that this wall was built with including straw, and they can tell that there was more straw at the bottom than there was at the top. The death of the firstborn. Inscriptions have been found showing that Thothmes IV succeeded Amenhotep II in Egypt, even though he was not his firstborn or his heir apparent. So you've got this guy succeeding to the throne after a man who and the guy who came next wasn't his firstborn, and he wasn't an heir apparent. Well, since it's from this same time period, I think we can reasonably assume that Thothmes IV, his firstborn, and he may have only had one, I don't know, but his firstborn was killed in the plagues, probably. The Rosetta Tablets, the Israelites were told not to boil a kid. Now, that's not a child, that's a goat. They were told not to boil a kid in its mother's milk. Does anybody remember reading that? And you're going, what in the world? They're being told not to boil a goat in its mother's milk? Well, for many years, people couldn't figure it out. What in the world is this about? These tablets, the Rosetta Tablets, show that this practice was a rite in the Canaanite religion, used as a magical means for making rain. So it makes a lot more sense now. I don't know if you have. I have sometimes been reading the Bible, and I've read stuff, and it has very specific details about stuff. And you think, what does that have to do with anything? Why do I even care? And I've come to the conclusion that those were put in there purposely by God in his omnipresence and omniscience and providence and all of those things. They were put in there by God knowing that there were going to be some things preserved in archaeology that would prove it and back it up. If some of these specific things, like not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, and there are thousands of things like that, if some of those specific things had not been recorded in God's Word, then this statement on the Rosetta Tablets would mean nothing to us either. It wouldn't mean anything to us. That the Canaanites, that was a part of their religion, their superstition, we might say. And so that wouldn't mean anything to us. But now we've got this verse, or two verses actually, in Exodus. And it makes a lot more sense now to us. Okay, the Hittites. I don't know if this is fairly well known. I don't know if any of you have looked at archaeology enough to know, but the Hittites are mentioned, as you know, a lot of times in the Bible. They're mentioned over 40 times in the books of the Bible, from Genesis to Ezekiel. The Hittites were so feared that on one occasion they caused the Syrians to run from Israel. Now, for many years, the critics of the Bible said that this was wrong. All this business about the Hittites is wrong. They said they're not mentioned anywhere else. We can't find any record anywhere else of the Hittites ever being mentioned anywhere. And they figured that if they really existed, we would have record of it somewhere. That's not necessarily true. But isn't it interesting that the ruins of Hittite cities have now been found? The ruins of Hittite cities. In the late 1800s, this guy discovered inscriptions in Syria that he designated as Hittite. In 1906, Hugh Winkler excavated Bagazkoy, or however you say that, Turkey, and discovered that the Hittite capital had been located on that very site. His find was all the more powerful because of the more than 10,000 clay tablets contained in the ancient city's library, containing the society's law system that eventually came to be known as the Hittite Code. And so for hundreds of years, they said, here we found a mistake in the Bible. These Hittites, they're mentioned a bunch of times in the Bible, these Hittites, and we don't have any record of them anywhere else. There's no Hittites. See, the Bible's wrong. And then they dig up cities of the Hittite civilization. Okay, let's see. Ira Price wrote of the Hittites, the lack of extra biblical testimony to their existence led some scholars about a half century ago to deny their historicity. They scoffed at the idea of Israel allying herself with such an unhistorical people as the Hittites, as we see in 2 Kings 6. But those utterances have vanished into thin air. It is what it is. When you dig up cities and you dig up libraries of books proving that the Hittites were there, what can they say? Okay, let's see here. All right, I'm going to go on. Kings against Sodom. In Genesis 14, we're told of 4 kings who came against Sodom. It was thought for a long time that this was false because there was no trade route there. In 1929, a mound was found in the area east of Gilead and Moab, which indicated that during about 2000 BC, it was a well-settled country. And so that would have been again before or around the time of Abraham. And so they found this part of their discoveries in Sodom showed that as well. Okay, this is a fairly famous one, the fall of Jericho. In 1929 through 36, Jericho was dug up. There's actually been 3 different excavations of Jericho. There have been 3 different ones. The most recent one, I think, was in the 50s. but there have been 3. Evidence showed it was destroyed about 1400 BC, about the time of Joshua. The walls were double, and they were 15 feet apart. The outer wall was 6 feet thick, and the inner wall was 12 feet thick. Both were about 30 feet high. The walls were linked together at the top with houses built on them or against them, like Rahab's. It was found that the walls fell outward. This is a drawing. There was an outer stone, and this is really, there's a lot of things interesting about Jericho, but there was an outer stone retaining wall that held a big slope. They call it a plastered glacis. It's a slope that comes down away from the city, and part of that was to make it more difficult to attack, because you had a wall, and then if they got over that wall, they had an incline that they had to go up to, and then there was another wall that they had to go over. And so this is a kind of a diagram of that. This one, it's a reconstruction of the north side of the ancient Jericho based on the German excavations from that time period. Notice the houses built against the mud brick city wall, which rests on top of the stone retaining wall. The Bible says Rahab's house was built on or against the city wall. Now, this is really interesting. This is kind of hard to, I don't know if this is the best diagram, but this is a sort of a drawing or a picture of what they found in regard to after, years later in 1900. What happened here is the red bricks there are the fallen bricks that were up on top of the city wall of Jericho. Okay, so the fallen mud bricks from the city wall at Jericho are shown in red in this cross-section cut of the defensive system of the city, and later rebuilding on the site. So what happened here, somebody turn to Joshua chapter 6, verse 5, and I want you to read that in just a minute. So it appears what happened here when they dug this up, it appears what happened here is when those bricks on the top of the wall fell and they fell out, they kind of crumbled up there, and that wall in effect almost made a ramp. It almost made a ramp for, we believe, the Israelites, and make it easier for the Israelites to take the city. And so they just ran up into the city. The walls had fallen. This made a ramp for them, and they just ran up into the city. Somebody read Joshua 6:5. Anybody? Okay, and that seems to indicate that what God told them, he said on the 7th day, when you march around and you scream and shout, the walls are going to fall. And he says, then you just go straight into the city at that point. And it seems to indicate what they found here. Like I said, that virtually created a ramp for them to go into the city. Now, we're just about out of time, so I'm going to finish with Jericho here, and we'll pick up the rest next week. Jars full of grain were found in Jericho. They were charred in a fire that the Israelites set to destroy the city there. Typically, when a city is captured, the people who capture the city take the spoils of war. Why were these grain jars full of grain? Well, for one thing, it was right after, we're told in Scripture, that it was right after the harvest season. But besides that, if you read Joshua 6, verses 17 through 19, we're not going to take time to read it, the Israelites were told not to take those things which were accursed or banned, and it included these things. And so Shazam, they dig up this city, and they find a whole bunch of jars, and whoever captured the city didn't even take the grain. They just left them there. Well, that's because God told them not to take the grain and the stuff that was there. The idea of the walls falling out, I think everybody knows this, but I just make the point. It's also very interesting because if the walls had been attacked in the normal way, they would have fallen in from the attack, right? I mean, that's how they attacked cities. They would use things to ram the wall, and eventually they would knock the city walls in. This is the only city in archaeological history, as far as I know, where the walls of a captured city have been found to fall outward. It makes no sense if the city was captured that the walls would fall outward. They were always busted and broken inward. The ashes and charcoal shows that the city had been burned, which in Joshua 6, those were the instructions. In addition, there were very few metals were found in the ruins. All right, we're going to stop there. We've got a whole bunch more to talk about, and so we'll do that next week. Some of them are just absolutely stunning and fascinating. Some of the more, now the ones we've covered so far have been basically things that were dug up in the 1800s or early 1900s. We're going to talk about some next week that were dug up not long ago. In fact, there's one, I think, that was dug up in 2019. Now, you think about how long those things have been sitting in the ground. And God knows they're there, and He's got them. So we'll talk about some more of those next week. Thanks for being here. Oh, wait a minute. Let me go ahead and give, no, I'll wait till next week. That's fine. I'll wait till next week. Thank you for being here.